Greetings and welcome to another episode of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s. I'm your host, Scott, and today with me is, of course, my co-host, Caleb, who, again, is wearing red flannel. Looks good on you.
It's another day that ends in a Y, so I decided to throw it on. And a 5-Iron Frenzy shirt and an old-timey baseball hat. I am a caricature of myself.
You know what you're like? You're like if you were to create a video game character and you would just like select like a hat and a shirt. Everything in there would just be a 5-iron shirt, and you'd always have a red flannel on, and then you can just switch out the hats.
That is it. You've nailed my revolving wardrobe. So,
Well, we're back to talk about the experience growing up as youth group kids in the 90s and how that has shaped us as adults. We'll talk to old friends about their faith journeys spanning from the 90s to today and discuss current cultural topics through the lens of someone who grew up during that era. So, Caleb, tell us, who's our guest today?
so I had never met him before we got together, so I was excited to meet somebody new and hear his story. And it was Alex.
Yes, Alex was very enthusiastic to chat with us, and it was a cool conversation because we're going a little bit off script here, so sorry for a bit of false advertising, but he was not in high school youth group in the 90s because he's like a decade younger than us. So he was more in the 2000s and late 2000s. So we kind of talk about that, and there are some interesting parts of his experience that I didn't identify with because I wasn't, I was kind of off and gone at that point. And here he is just kind of going through some things that I faced and we faced as young adults. And he was just coming out of high school with it. So it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, his youth group experience was just very different, right? He's in a youth group that was just, I think the word is more established. I mean, they're in a building that they own. It's just a different feel. There's no way around it, at least for part of it. I think they still might have had some experience. But yeah, it's a very different experience, and just the world events of the last 15 years hit him much differently than they hit us. We're raising families. I don't believe he didn't get into it. I don't know. I don't think he's raising a family over the last 15 years where you and I are. I mean, we both have kids who are kind of in that age range. And so I just feel like it's a much different experience. It was really interesting to hear.
For the record, I do believe that he has like a newborn. So it's just at that stage of like, oh, my life got turned upside down. But even in the discussion that we shared, there were some things he talked about that had changed just within the 10-year difference of us all of going to youth group. And so stay till the end. We'll talk about why our craziest memories were the same event, but different for him because the youth group had learned like, hey, let's not be too illegal. Let's just kind of borderline, illegal activity.
Let's not be illegal. Let's be inappropriate. This is the guidance for all church activities.
Yeah. As things progress, you become less illegal, but still inappropriate. No, Alex, thanks for coming on. We really enjoyed the conversation we had with you. And Kale, we're seeing a trend. We're like, oh, maybe these conversations will go like half an hour, and all of a sudden we look and it's like 55 minutes, and we're like, oh boy. So we're trying to keep these as short as we can, but these experiences are important to people. They want to talk about them.
I feel like we could have even gone longer, to be totally honest. And so maybe there's an opportunity too. Maybe we kind of find that we have guests on, and if people really enjoy the conversation, want to hear more, might have to have somebody back and get some of those specific questions. So if there's stuff that came up, I think we'd love to hear it. Like, what did Alex talk about that stirred something in you that it'd be interesting to hear more of? I think that could be an interesting conversation.
Anybody can return as a guest as long as they're nice to us. So,
and his audio was really nice and really easy to edit. So that was a bonus.
Very good. That because he's like a Gen Z or whatever he is, or end of the millennial stage, working in a church through the pandemic. He had to learn how to do it.
Well, he mentioned, it wasn't on the show, but he mentioned at one point that him and his wife were like messing around with podcasts. So I was like, all right, somebody who's done the work. Yes.
Well, Alex, thanks again. We appreciate your time, and we hope you all enjoy this episode. Thanks for listening.
Hi, this is Caleb, the producer of the show, just breaking in like I do every episode to remind everyone that the views and opinions expressed on this show may not actually be held or even approved of by everyone appearing on this episode. One of the goals of this show is to give everyone a safe space to share their opinions and thoughts on deeply personal matters of faith. We are not looking to start an argument, but instead let people share how they feel. We also know that our memories of events that happened 25 to 30 years ago may not be 100% accurate. We assume everyone's best intentions as they share how they remembered the experience of their youth. Now, back to the show.
Okay, we are here with Alex. Alex, thank you for joining us this evening. It is great to have you, and it is even greater to see you again. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. It's good to be here. Yeah, it's been 15 years? Feels like that.
A long time. I have to say that Alex is already, I guess, to change the ethos of this podcast, which is that he did not go to youth group in the 90s. In fact, he was in youth group about a decade after Caleb and I. So we will put a caveat on there and say Alex's experience is different than ours a little bit, given that he's much younger and much more handsome than both Caleb and I. So it's a very it might be a very different experience. But Alex, can you kind of tell us just what was your background with Five Oaks? What was your background? Why were you attending? How long were you there for?
Yeah, so I grew up at Five Oaks. My parents had brought me there when I think I was maybe 5. So really, really early on, it was kind of all I had known. And so my family just faithfully attended, and we moved to a spot that was about a mile away from the church when the church was built, when it moved out of like middle school. And so, yeah, no, it was with me from as long as I've had memory.
So as a youth, you were like in the little kids ministry, elementary, all the way up through through high school.
The last time I checked, there are still like pictures of little tiny me on the inside closet door. Back in the kids' room. Yeah.
I think this means that you technically attended the church longer than both Caleb and I did combined.
Wow.
And we're pretty close there.
Including staff time too, almost certainly, because I started probably at the age of 5, and then I was on staff until probably 21, 22.
I did not realize this. Tell us about that. So you graduated high school, and then right after you jumped onto staff?
Yep. And it sounds weird, but it really didn't feel weird stepping into that, just being as involved as I was at Five Oaks. I was there all the time already, and they just kind of identified me as someone that like could run their social media accounts. And so I was like, great, if I can get paid to hang around longer, I will. And I was volunteering at the middle school group at that time. And so then I took on kind of a role as like the middle school worship director. And then that turned into the student ministries worship arts director. And so that was a really fun part-time gig that I had with them for about 4 years.
That's crazy. I did not know that. Caleb, and we're just going to end up talking to a lot of people who stayed. You and I didn't stay. Like we left. We were out of there.
Yeah. No kidding. I was off to college, and then I'd come back for the summers and say hi, and that was it. I was gone.
Yeah.
I would have been too if I would have been able to leave, but because of my grades and our income, it was community college, and I always knew that was kind of the route, and I was fortunate enough to have parents that let me live at home, and so it wasn't necessarily that I wouldn't have left if I couldn't have. I loved the place, but if I would have gotten the opportunity to live on campus, out of state, I think I would have taken that in a heartbeat.
Gotcha. Now, just to clarify this, because I do want to make sure this, I, as a youth, volunteered for junior high youth group. So this must mean that when I was in high school leading junior high youth group, you were in junior high.
You would have been one of my leaders for sure. Yeah.
Oh boy.
Very, very strong memories of a gingered, skinnier guy.
Weirdo.
Running around. Yeah.
Well, because this podcast is fully for my affirmation, can you please tell me where I rank in the pantheon of leaders that you've had in your life?
Oh, the best.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
No, it's there's no hesitation. Like Global Leadership Summit, I've been to a lot of them. Have been under a lot of really great pastors and Scott Teese above them all.
All right. Well, thank you, and we're done. It's nice to get an early bedtime. Appreciate the lies. But so you're you're younger than us, which is great. From your perspective, like, what are some of those most impactful times of your youth group experience? Like, what are some things that you remember and even hold on to now as an adult?
Yeah, so I mean, apart from trips, because I think I could rant about the trips, different mission trips, different EFCA conferences that we went to, camps. I think Five Oaks did camps really well.
Mm-hmm.
I think just like the daily being at youth group with friends that you felt comfortable with was probably the most impactful part for me. Is I just felt like I was at home. Yeah, it was just the most kind of meaningful part to me was having a social group that I felt like I could be fully myself with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what Five Oaks Youth Group I think did pretty well is they instilled pretty good community with the kids. So that being said, with all those experience, like, how would you describe your faith back then in the early aughts, in the early 2000s? Like, give it a word or give it a phrase. How would you describe what your faith looked like?
Early 2000s. So I grew up in the church, grew up very kind of classic Christian conservative, or at least classic from my, context, and did the whole Bible memory verse thing. So I have a plaque somewhere in my parents' house. It's like 100 verses memorized, and I think I was like 5 or something. So was very familiar with the church, and pretty classic transition in my time at youth group from head to heart. I had known a lot of the stuff, really grew up just memorizing, and yeah, it hadn't become really real until I think the defining moment was Challenge, which was one of these conferences, that we go off to.
I think I went to a Challenge or two. Caleb was probably gone by then, but yeah, so a lot of times those conferences for us as evangelical kids made a big difference, right?
Oh yeah.
Caleb and I talked about the other day, like doing a Billy Graham conference, which is a big deal in the late 90s, but every denomination has good conferences, but there was very much a bring your friends, we're going to accept Christ kind of thing.
Classic evangelical. Yeah, totally.
Given that comparison with where your faith's was back then, how would you say it compares to where it's at today?
Sure, yeah. So I'll say that at that Challenge trip, I'd kind of been moving towards being all in, and then just through the speakers, there was a moment that I remember standing up during this like reflection part where we're all in a park, and I remember saying and really feeling like, hey, if this is true, we have to go tell everyone. And so in that moment, I was so all in, and I was so sure that like this is the purpose of my life, and this is who I am. Like, this is the core of my identity. This is what I want to be. This is what I want to represent. Mm-hmm. And I still am largely that, but my faith going out of the high of the Christian conference experience and into community colleges and public universities and even seminaries, and just coming up against a lot of different ways of thinking about God and thinking about the Bible. And I think that I, in my faith right now, still believe that Jesus is who he says he was, who he says he is. And I'm holding a lot of my peripheral beliefs, maybe I'll call them, a little bit looser. There's a lot of stuff that just didn't seem to make a ton of sense, at least when I interacted with people that I was being told about. And I was like, this doesn't match what I was told about these people, doesn't match what I now feel like I've experienced about these people. And so I have to reestablish a lot of what I really believe. And so there's a lot floating, about my faith right now. But I think the main things are still there. So I still have a fairly strong faith and that is mostly in the person of Jesus.
You still hold on to it like in a different way.
Yes. It's very different.
And what were some of those people that you like ran into that you had maybe some presuppositions about? Like, how did that play out?
Sure. I don't know that it was ever a full, like, these people groups are bad or this faith is bad.
Mm-hmm.
But because I do think that Five Oaks and the leadership at Five Oaks was pretty good about not giving into that, like, black and white, these are in groups, these are out groups, you shouldn't trust these people.
Mm-hmm.
And at the same time, I remember being just, like, perplexed by just, like, the beauty and sincerity of friends of Jewish and Muslim faiths at my Christian at the University of Minnesota, where I ended up going. And, like, the relationships of queer folks that had very deep and loving monogamous relationships that I was like, man, like, I don't see why this is so against God's plan and purpose. So anyway, yeah, just seeing stuff that looked a lot more like love and who God is and what God intends that seemed to be, in my upbringing, outside of the bounds of what was acceptable, I think really shook me up a bit. That also, I mean, we could go on and on about Trumpism and how that kind of shook up my generation, but truly that also was like, okay, so much of the church is latching onto this public figure. I can't understand why. Like, he seems to be going against everything that I was brought up to believe, but it seems like a lot of church people that I really trust are also latching onto this. So there's this whole, like, institutional distrust too that also flies up against some experiential things. And yeah, so there, like, definitely the buzzword being Reconstruction is something that I have gone through and am still somewhat going through.
That's great. I really appreciate your honesty. And to be honest, like, I've had similar experiences as you where, you know, you kind of get out into that real world, and you realize it's not quite the antagonistic place that it was sold to us as. And people in culture really aren't against us unless you're an ass, you know, which, again, then if you are, then you should be against us.
Right.
And even then, when Christians are like assholes, they'll be like, "Oh, the world could be against me." That's what the Bible, like, they'll use it as an excuse just to kind of be antagonistic or anti something. And I realized something sounds like you did too early on. It's like, it's really easy for Christians to be known for what they're against and what they're anti, and not for what they're, you know, for. And I think that your experience is similar, and it's bringing up something like Trump is interesting to me, because your generation definitely experiences that way different than mine. But the distrust of, hey, you told me one thing, and now you're not only adopting another one, but almost proselytizing a different set of morals. It doesn't make sense to me. So it's interesting to hear that your generation reacted the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that there's something about specifically, like, my generation, and technically I am, like, the very last millennial year. So the cutoff is 1994, which is when I was born. But also, like, we did not grow up the same, you know? And so, like, I reached my mid-20s, you know, like this critical formative time of what do I really believe being out in the world during the pandemic, during this racial awakening that we were having in this country, and as Trumpism was full-fledged. And so seeing large portions of the church, especially the church that I grew up with, actively, like, say, like, no, I mean, like, I literally got messages in my like Facebook inbox saying, like, racism actually isn't that bad. And so stuff like just like, for me, as someone that feels like, I don't know, I was brought up to bring I was brought up to believe that Jesus loves everyone and is passionate about, like, seeing heaven on earth now. Trumpism and Christians not being interested in Black liberation because it threatened some area of their worldview was like very, very off-putting to me, and really did shake a lot of the foundations of my faith, because like I did have to realize that like, okay, a lot of my faith was built on people and Christian leadership in this country specifically.
Well, and a lot of that is like, I have to be secure here in my country or my home or my culture or my community. Like, that has to be safe before I can then be safely, proactively Christian or whatever. Like, there's a sense that when that is threatened, you're going to defend that first rather than operate on the, morality of peace and the morality of love that Jesus brings. So I've had very, very similar tracks. So, and we can probably do tons of episodes about comments that we've heard or messages that we received that were unsolicited. So, it's a thing, right? Is especially in the age of the internet, people feel very courageous to say what they want to say behind a keyboard. And if you're offending them, they're going to be ready to do that. In that regard, I'm kind of curious, like, is there a certain event or a teaching from your time in youth group that really stands out to you that is you are kind of way opposite on, or you've totally dropped, or is completely different for you now?
When I look back on like youth group teachings, I don't necessarily remember any specific teaching. So one I have thought back to, and I'll get back to this, but I do remember just like the reverence and the honesty that the leaders. Tim was the guy that was my youth leader, youth pastor, like looked up to him a ton, still look up to him. And like more than any specific lessons sticking out, I thought he did an absolutely incredible job of both being like reverent with scripture and teaching us that like this book is special and it is inspired, and we can't, that's a whole thing of evangelism, right? Is that like sola scriptura, right? It's like this thing is how we understand God, and the reverence, but also he was so honest and charismatic and really like cared. And you could tell in his teachings that he cared about the students and that he was honest about like, okay, in life, this is what it's like, and these are some examples, and this is how we can apply all of this stuff. One example that sticks out that I do think about differently now, and I'm still trying to figure out how I think about it differently, but I do think about it differently, is this is a good example of that. Tim, I remember saying, as we approached a sexuality like week or like something like that, I think this was my junior year of high school, he said, now, it seems like the science is telling us, which as a Christian, especially a Christian in leadership at that time, is kind of a wild thing to say. So like you pay attention at this point. He's like, it seems like gay folks generally do not choose to be gay. Like it is a thing that they are born with. And it also seems like this was the language I remember, because I replayed this in my head of like, okay, like this is a hot topic, and Tim is being like very honest and like pulling us back to what the Bible says. He says it also seems like the Bible is saying this is a no-go as far as homosexual actions go. And so I really appreciated that first he did say this controversial thing of it seems like being gay is not a choice, which at that time very controversial. So for him to come out and say that was like, okay, wow. And then he also came back and said, and there's this really hard truth. I think he said, I don't want this to be the truth, but this is what I believe the Bible says, is that homosexual actions are wrong. And so being in seminary and having gone through the world and having tons of gay friends and having friends that are gay and Christian and having friends that are gay and were kicked out of the church, and it's this very sore thing. have come to be very unsure. I've heard interesting arguments on all of the sides, and there's smart people that believe a lot of different ways about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I really don't want to believe that we can't at least make an exception in the same way that we do with divorce and remarried, because in the Bible, divorce and getting remarried is just as big of an issue, if not more. It's for sure mentioned more than making some sort of an accommodation for gay monogamous or queer monogamous folks. Anyway, I've just come to think about it in terms of like, we have grace for certain people that we are used to. Why can't we start to have grace for people that we have not traditionally been more inclusive of? And that has been a hard thing to come to, because in my grown up or in my youth and in the culture and the ideology that I was steeped in, it's a very literal reading of scripture. And it's a very like, okay, this is what the Bible says. And so that's it. Sola Scriptura. And I, just since feel that I don't know. And that's tough because I love knowing. And that has been so much of this like period of the last 10 years of my life of like realizing more and more like what I thought I knew no longer makes sense to me. And I have to be able to hold things loosely and say, I don't know, because there are other smart people that have very smart opinions on this that meet my heart a little bit better than the ideology and maybe the theologies that I grew up with.
I think that's a really incredible answer, to be frank with you. I think that moving forward, that issue is going to, frankly, be one that our kids, our grandkids look back on and be like, you guys believe what? Because we believe the same thing about generations before us about certain topics. We could list a bunch. And it's like, you got to be comfortable with things changing. I've said it before, and maybe I'll say it every episode, but if you had a nickel for every time a group of Christians thought their way of interpreting the Bible was 100% correct, you'd be rich. And so we just, evangelicals in the 90s, early 2000s, like they fall into that same trap. And what I have seen on that topic, to be very interesting, is there was a shift, and you had this really interesting to say that in your experience in youth group, from it's a choice and they're choosing to sin, to a small step forward, to it's not a choice, but if those people are born that way, they must at least think about, they must be celibate, right? That's a small shift. And I remember friends and people who are still close to me that are conservative being like, that's just an example of a slippery slope. Like, you give them an inch and then like, what's going to happen in 10 years or 20 years? And it's like, dude, that happened to the church in the 70s and 80s to bring you what you had. So you can't be afraid of change or progress that way. You have to kind of lean into it and do the thing that you're saying, which is be like, you know what, sometimes I don't know. And people are going to end up being affirming. People are going to end up maybe kind of falling in the middle and so working on it. So you're not alone in any of that.
Oh, I know. And I like people my age. I go back to people my age just because it is kind of a crazy time for the 20 somethings and like even early 30s who were really, well, the youth group kids from my generation, because as we were getting into the real world, also the whole world was like falling apart, and the Christian church in this country was absolutely just like at each other's throats. So it will be interesting to see just how many of us left the faith, because it's gotta be, we know, I mean, the numbers tell us that my generation specifically is leaving the church in droves, and that trend is only gonna continue.
You never know. I mean, or they could be going to church differently, you know? I mean, they could be leaving other churches, but in general, that is absolutely the case, and that's really shows no signs of stopping, which, you know, look, it's concerning. Even as much as I've changed, I still would like people to do that. I think it's important. But, I mean, from your perspective, just going off the cuff a little bit, like, why do you think that is? Why do you think people who are on the tail end of the millennials slash beginning of what Gen is it Gen X? I don't know what the Gen Z.
I'm Gen X. That's how old I am, by the way.
Ooh.
So I'm Gen X.
Ooh, we got three generations. Well, no, never mind.
Zero millennial too, Scott. Right?
I guess whatever.
Yes. Own it.
Yes.
Own it.
But like, why do people kind of in that age group that you're in? Like, why do you think they're just leaving? And traditionally, people start families. That's when they come back, but that's not happening anymore.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things, right? It's really hard to pinpoint, but I do think that there's this interesting combination of what seems like blatant hypocrisy by the religious right, which is the most visible expression of Christian, at least especially in our political season right now. Evangelicals are getting all the airtime, and the airtime they're getting is because they're so attached to Trump. And so that really bugs my generation, at least almost all of the folks that I have talked to that are my age that are Christian or formerly Christian, and this kind of thing has really blown up. But also, for sure, just as we've become more multicultural, the American Christian church, just has less and less social cachet. People aren't expected to go to church every Sunday. It's not the thing to do. It's not I think the meeting place that it once was. But I do think if I'm going to point to something, it's for sure the hypocrisy.
I think that's an honest answer. Especially with the internet and the advent of the internet, it's pretty easy to see right through a lot of that stuff.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. The internet for sure blew up a lot of stuff of wait, okay, if I'm going to actually fact check you here, and I have sources that I don't know, because it's either you are going to believe that most research done by large institutions is real, and then you're going to have some pretty hard problems to solve with just conservative literal interpretations of scripture, or you're going to say, okay, universities, large, big science isn't just out to get Christians. Now that puts us with a new set of facts. All truth is God's truth, right? So we have to somehow recognize that this Bible is a complicated, wonderful book, and there's some real wrestling that we have to do here,
Hey, you're forgetting one very important thing, which is that, I'm going to be snarky here, evangelicals love the victim card. So, I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
We lost a listener, Caleb, I'm sorry. But
we're down to 6.
We're down, we dropped to single digits. But there's a lot of that, right? Is that the world's against us, which is, I think, part of the Trump phenomenon, which is we need a protector. We need someone to fight for us. But look, I see it in my own family. I see it everywhere. It's not just evangelicals. Everyone plays the victim card when it's to their advantage. But you would think for a group of people who believe they've lost the world and gained the greatest gift of all, that they wouldn't want. They'd probably lose a little bit of their victim mentality.
Oh, for sure. I mean, back to your point about being known for what we're not about. We're also known, I don't know, maybe this is wrong. It feels like we're known as a mopey, just angry bunch, And I feel like it's counter the message.
Perception is reality in some regards. Fair or unfair. That's the truth.
Yep.
That's the truth. What are some things about the youth group experience that you had that you look back and you just kind of have a problem with? I mean, in youth group you talked about the homosexuality talk, which was a little, at the time, a big deal for you. What are some things you look back on now? You're like, ugh, that was. I mean, it doesn't have to be a teaching. It can be an event, or it can be it can be a activity that we did.
I will say, in complete honesty, that middle school through high school, were some of the greatest years of my life, and I really loved being in the youth group for almost every single minute. And whether or not it was all rose-colored glasses, is still unknown, because I still look back really fondly on almost all of it. There's a lot of theology and maybe some methodology that I disagree with now, or like it just feels a little bit more markety. I don't know. Like growing up in an evangelistic church, it felt like sometimes the emphasis was so much on like invite your friends that it did kind of feel like this. And I was pushing this. Seriously, I was one of the people that would sit down in the student leadership meetings like, you guys, we have to be inviting more people. Like, we have to get our numbers up. Like, this is about souls. You know what I'm saying? So, like, I was a pusher of the, like, we gotta get our numbers up kind of like almost business mentality. And I do think the heart behind it was good. And it still felt like we got to sell these people Jesus because it's on us. It's on us to save these souls. And I look back at that and I'm like, man, like, it's great that like God can use us to do that. And that's also God's work. So I don't know. I think a lot of evangelicals get caught up in the like, we're going to win souls for Jesus. And it's like, and I currently look back on that and feel a little icky about that. But it comes from a wholesome place, I think.
Yeah, there wasn't a lot of teaching like, here's how you connect with somebody to get to care about them as a person. You're only taught to connect with them so insofar as you can save their soul, which is, look, if you truly believe in that people are going to hell, then yes, you should do that. You should probably also quit your job and just do that. But
right, straight up.
But like, they're and you know, again, not for because they were ignorant or they just didn't care. They were they were doing their best. They were putting their best foot forward. But there wasn't a lot of like, hey, invest in somebody first because of who they are or because of who God created them to be, and then figure it out from there. It was more like, you know, Caleb and I were talking about this the other day. We would put. You probably didn't see this when you were in high school, but we would, for like our youth group events, we would take like just 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, print something off on it, and we would paste it to our backpacks and walk around school with them as advertisements for the event. Just be like, hey, we're inviting people, maybe they'll show up. And like, okay, you know, again, best of intentions, but it wasn't about the person themselves.
Very cool as well. We were very, very cool.
People pay attention to us. Yeah.
Signs stapled to our backs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we did similar. Not quite the signs stapled, but for sure tons of like putting stuff on boards and handing out flyers and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Par for the course. So it's interesting you talk about the numbers game, and as I understand it, it's like now you are part of a church or you work at a church. Like, how did that part of like bringing people to God in the 90s or in the 2000s, like that was a numbers game, like we got to get more people in. How did that translate into what you're doing or what have done recently in the church?
Yeah. So it's kind of a tough balance because you are kind of always forced to examine your motives behind growing a church because to a degree you just have to like there is a budget that you have to maintain to keep people working there, and you do want to see people to meet God. And so there is this tension of you want to be doing it for the right reasons. And so the pastor that I started under at this church that I've been working at for a while now really was about growth over health, and he would just repeat that all or health over growth.
Whoa,
that so funny.
You went to a mega church?
Full on was just like, I don't care about these people. I just want their money.
I didn't know you worked at Grace and Edina. Sorry.
Evil Brook?
Sorry.
No,
I like that very much.
No. Okay, that's so funny that I got that backwards. No, truly, yeah, I would just keep preaching health over growth. I had to slow down to make sure I got that right. Like, growth is a naturally occurring thing of something that is healthy and flourishing. And so I think that using that as our base of like, we got to make sure the people that want to be here are thriving. And that being it just, people want to be a part of something that is exciting and people are excited about it, and it doesn't we're actually funny enough, we're in a series right now on evangelism, And yeah, that's kind of a little bit of what we're talking about, is if we are going to be good stewards of the good news that God is for us, and that he came about 2,000 years ago, then we're going to have to live that out, and it will kind of be it'll be natural. All I have to say. So there's a tension between, we do like practically need more people, especially our small congregation, but at the same time, like, we're not going to have growth for the sake of growth.
Interesting. So would you describe that church that you're at now as an evangelical church?
No, it's a Presbyterian church.
Okay. Sometimes people get as we grow up into adults, it's like, oh, there is value in a Presbyterian church, or there is value in the Lutheran tradition. I certainly got to be at that point, and Kayla and I have talked about quite a bit too. It's maybe it toned down a little bit in the aughts, but like in the 90s, it was like, hey, if somebody's a Catholic, you better go minister to them because they don't really know Jesus. Like, obviously, it wasn't that blatant with us, but like there was still that kind of message, like, hey, they haven't actually crossed the line of faith, so we better go take from their group to add ours.
Yeah. No, I didn't experience a ton of that growing up, but yeah.
Good job, Tim. Good job. Well, some of the things that I enjoy looking back on is, like, I know when I was 18, went to college, got out of high school, I knew it all, right? I was ready to go. I was going to conquer the world and make a huge difference. And now looking back, I'd like to tell that 18-year-old kid, like, shut the hell up. Like, just learn. Like, what would you say to yourself now, as you're much closer to 18 than I am, but, like, still, you've had a ton of life experience since that time. Like, what would you say to your 18-year-old self?
Oh, I mean, I completely agree. Even reading that question before I came, I was like, I would tell the 18-year-old, you do not know everything. In fact, you have to recognize that the world is going to surprise you, and you have to be open to that, because if you're so sure that your doctrines and your Romans road is going to get you through the world and going to save the people that you encounter, like, you're in for a tough awakening. And I was.
Yeah, it's look, we're not supposed to know everything at 18, but you get the sense. I think probably all 18-year-olds that way. So in a spiritual sense, it's good to look back and see what we can teach. But in the opposite way, like, if your 18-year-old self ran into you now, like, would he be pissed, or would he be like, oh, okay, I get it?
I don't know. I'd like to think that, like, both of myselves look at each other with some level of grace, but who the heck knows? I mean, I was such a pumped up, like, I'm a super Christian and I'm gonna, like, I mean, like you, like, I thought I was going to maybe not be the next Billy Graham, but I was like, I know that I want to do professional ministry, and I know that, like, my gifts are in that area, and I think that I have the stuff. So I think I was fairly cocky, so that's why I would tell my 18-year-old self, like, hey, cool it, you don't know everything. Actually, there's a lot that you don't know. But I would tell my 29-year-old self, don't get too disillusioned, because the temptation in all this deconstruction has been to just kind of follow it into the abyss and be like, nothing is knowable. I don't know if any of this is real. Like, I think my 18-year-old self would be like, no, like, these like profound spiritual experiences that you had in youth group and outside of youth group, like, it's not like some spiritual placebo. Like, it's not just the hype. Like, you had these experiences. You have experienced God. You have experienced this incredible community. Like, remember that. And that is something I still have to tell myself, as sometimes it just feels like, man, like, I just have so many questions, and I grew up, in such a, like, there's an answer to everything, and I'm going to explain my way around it 8 different times, because the ultimate goal is to, like, convince someone else of the security of my beliefs, to moving into the world and being like, man, like, is anything knowable? Like, truly? So not getting too far on either side, I think has been the tough balance of my 20s.
I can safely say that the teacher, or I'm going to mess up the analogy, the student has become the teacher, because what you just said, like, resonates with me, because I can get, even today, I was cynical as an 18-year-old, which means I'm like extra cynical now. And so like I can still remember that feeling of like whatever, just, yeah, that kind of like deeply entrenched like anti-establishment part of me. And that has kind of parlayed into, well, it's just a big operation, church is just kind of an industry kind of thing. And, to hear you say that, yeah, I would tell myself, like, don't get too down on it. Like, maybe try and recapture some of that joy and some of that passion. It's not a bad thing. And that's going to look different for other people. Maybe it means instead of going out and, proselytizing the way you would, maybe it's investing more, but like keep that energy going. That's really great.
I was just going to say, the further I get from youth group and the more I've gotten into, as you called it, the real world, it's tougher to have those spiritual experiences. You really got to seek them out. And what's great about like being a high schooler is like I don't know, like it was easier to go out and find them and be a part of groups that wanted to experience God together in ways that we don't get as adults, So it's not like the opportunities aren't there. They're just fewer and further between.
Yeah.
So
100%.
Yeah, just trying to be more intentional as I've gotten away from the structure of it.
That's great. Is there like a books or teachings or just theologians you've kind of like gravitated towards or ones that you resonate a lot with now? Because you did go through seminary, correct?
I did. Yep.
So did you go to Bethel?
I did. I went to Bethel Sem, yeah.
Me too. That counts 2 Bethel Sem grads who have deconstructed. Put that on their website. But
oh my gosh, it's got to be so many more. But yeah, I know what you mean.
I will credit that seminary, which was that they were not like, this is the right way or else. Like they actually really challenged a lot of that. So it's glad to hear
straight
that
up
they're still doing that.
100%. A big reason I deconstructed was how many different, like, very interesting and convincing arguments they let me read. They were like, right, there's 1,000 different ways to deal with these controversial issues. Read these books. And I was like, I thought I knew what I believed, and now I have no clue. And I'm still there a lot of the time.
Look, I've said this publicly, and I don't think she minds telling me this. She's not going to listen anyway. I don't know if she knows how to, but my mom, who's not as politically liberal as I am, she's actually quite opposite, will get mad at what she perceives as my college experience turning me into a Democrat, or at least a progressive, or whatever, that you turn to the dark side. And I went to a liberal arts school, undergrad, and I was like, no, it wasn't that. It was seminary. It was 100%
right.
What we thought was a conservative seminary down the road, but at least, thankfully, they gave us that opportunity to process and decide for ourselves what we believe.
Yeah. I do also, whenever I tell people like how my seminary was, I do also say like credit to them for not shoving one view down our throats, because a lot of places do that. I will say that I love Christian mystics now, and so like the Richard Rohr folks, like, love all that. And as I've been getting further from answers and more towards questions and being okay with questions, the more I just gravitate to folks that are able to hold things a little bit more loosely. So I'll give Richard Rohr a shout.
Shout out. Hey, my favorite quote, frankly, honestly, is Richard Rohr: "Myth is always true, and sometimes it actually happened." I'm just like, yes, that's 100% right. And it gives you a different way of just interpreting the stories that you've been told for so long. So that's great. I think as over time, it's important to kind of step up or step out into different areas of that theological experience. So that's one I always tell people to go to, but there's a ton of them.
Yeah.
There's a ton of authors out there. Well, like overall, like just blanket statements, like how do you see your experience in youth group just contributing to you are as the person you are today and who you're growing into?
it's honestly very hard for me to detangle my identity still from like youth group because they were such formative years, and I had slowly kind of solidifying midway through high school my identity as a Christian and as a member specifically of the Five Oaks Youth Group. So truly, like when I look back on it, incredible moments, incredible friends, incredible people, and I am so thankful that I was at Five Oaks and that the people that were there when I was there were there. But probably the big ways I think that the leadership there and the friends that I made there really gave me a strong sense of what church could be and should be. Just a really committed, loving group of folks that really deeply cared about each other and wanted to honor God. And it was, it was really, really incredible to be a part of.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's real cool. Final question for you. You got to think really hard about this.
Oh boy.
What was the craziest, zaniest, maybe now offensive, currently outlandish thing that you did, even not as a youth but maybe even as a leader? Like, was there an event? Was there a game where you're like, hey, someone might go to the hospital, or we shouldn't have done this now? Like, is there something that you look back on and you're just like, that was insane?
Oh man, so many things. Kidnapping
Yes!
middle schoolers is probably has someone said that yet or no?
Yes. That's mine.
Has someone said that already? Okay.
So you did.
Can I use that?
Absolutely. I mean, we didn't.
Okay.
We absolutely. You can definitely use that.
Okay, because straight up, like, that is a wild practice that Five Oaks did, and I think by the time that I was a leader in doing it myself, it wasn't quite as intense. But the legends of literal adults driving to people's houses and pulling screaming sixth graders out of their house, like, who does that? You couldn't do that today.
I did it.
You know?
Yep.
Wild. Like, there are legal problems, there are emotional problems, there are religious like, the list goes on, and yet it was awesome. Like, would do it again, would go to jail for it. Like, oh man, like, who decided that this was cool? You know, maybe honestly different time, probably because of how much the church was trusted. I truly believe that, like, the church as an institution can get away with much, much less in the way of specifically kidnapping kids.
10 out of 10 would kidnap.
Would kidnap again? What I mean, like, so we had Caleb and I asked this question on our. We recorded an intro episode, and we asked that question of each other. And of the guests we've had, I think it's kind of a fun question to end with, just because listeners out there, or however many we have, it's like, yeah, everybody's youth group experience is different, but there are some things that are similar. And I really want to know if, like, other youth groups kidnapped sixth graders, because we totally did it. And my story is that at least one year for sure, the caravan of cars driving around got pulled over. So we
by the cops?
By the cops, 100%.
You're kidding?
Nope, absolutely happened. Got pulled over. The cops saw us, the kids. Some of them were definitely crying in the car. We're all dressed like maniacs. It was like, Caleb, it's we call it hazing, right? I mean, it's basically hazing.
Yeah,
straight up.
Yeah.
And okay, yeah. So for the folks that don't know, this is like the induction into the middle school youth group. Is the leaders would go around and grab unsuspecting sixth graders and, like, steal them away for, was it a night back then? Because by my time it was like a full night sleepover thing.
If anything, it was just at least a weekend.
Okay, yeah.
I think it was just the night, wasn't it? Did parents would pack a bag for the night, and I'll be honest, I think it started as I don't know if I ever actually participated in it, because I think it might have started as I was leaving. So, because I couldn't remember that one. When Scott said it, I was like, oh my gosh, I do remember you guys doing that. So,
in what world is that okay?
Alex,
It's great.
Did we kidnap you?
Yeah.
You probably did.
I mean, not from my house, but I do remember. Yeah, by that time, it was like just, oh yeah, everyone go to the back of the church. Like it's cool. No one will be like waiting for you to like tackle you to the ground or anything.
Oh my gosh.
So, no, much tamer. I mean, I still for sure got tackled, but like, I wasn't dragged out of my
bedroom
bed in the middle of the night or anything like that.
Yeah, it was that was wild. Well, hey, really appreciate this conversation. Great to reconnect. Maybe we'll do it again here sometime, but your willingness to open up and just kind of describe where you've been and where you're at is, what we're going for. Super interesting. So really appreciate you sharing with us.
Of course. Love to do it.
So
thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Thanks for coming on, Alex.
Yeah.
Thanks again to Alex for joining us on this edition of I Survived Youth Group in the 90s, even though this was the 2000s version. It was great to hear from Alex and just hear about his experience. I loved his answer when he was talking about the idea that he just had become more comfortable with the idea of, I don't know. It was a great answer and just some really insightful stuff. Another exciting conversation and just the excitement people have about youth group. It almost felt like he was holding it in this reverent state. It was that important and that exciting to him. It was really exciting to hear and really interesting to hear from him. So we thank Alex for coming on the show. It was great to talk to him and hopefully get to talk to him again at some point. It was really great for me to meet him and to just have that chance to talk with him. So one last time, thanks Alex for joining us. Let us know what you thought about this show or any of our other shows. You can find us on Twitter at the handle @SurvivedYG. You can also email us at ISurvivedYouthGroup@gmail.com. If you're interested in being on the show, let us know. You didn't necessarily have to attend the youth group we did. Eventually, we do want to start kind of expanding this out and hearing about different people's experience from other youth groups from the 90s and even the 2000s. So again, feel free to email us or find us on Twitter. We'd love to connect. Please subscribe and share the podcast. If you're so inclined, leave a rating or review. If you enjoy this show, you might also enjoy the other podcast I do. It's a music podcast called the Album Anniversary Podcast. Over the last couple of years, I've researched and documented the release date of thousands of albums. Throughout the week, I post about them on social media. We've had a couple different formats on the show, but it's a chance to sit down and talk about some of the music I've documented on my calendar. Once again, that is the Album Anniversary Podcast. The music at the beginning and the end of this show is the instrumental version of the song Positive Charge by the artist Dread Pirate Roberts. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon.